Magandang araw. This is our video discussion for module number 16 for BAM 026. And our lesson title is Extinguishment of Obligation Part 7, Novation. So this is the last mode of extinguishment of obligation in our law on obligations and contracts. But like I have told you, this is not the only way to extinguish an obligation. It's just so happened that these are the general modes of extinguishment of an obligation. First, for our lesson objectives, at the end of this module, you can define novation and state its requisites, identify and explain the different kinds of novation, state the effects of novation, and explain subrogation and state its effects. For our productivity tip, keeping yourself in track is never an easy thing to do. Struggle is real, as they say, but so is conquering the day. So decide how to tackle your day every single day. Keep safe and happy learning. All right, so for our lesson preview, so like I've said, generally there are 6 modes of extinguishment of an obligation, and these are as follows. Number 1, payment or performance. Number 2, loss of the thing due. Number 3, remission or condonation. 4, confusion or merger of rights. 5, compensation. And number 6, novation. Of course, in the previous modules, we have already discussed the first 5 modes of extinguishment of obligation. So, of course, you need to pause this for a while and answer the what I know chart. Welcome back. So, what is novation? Novation is the total or partial extinction of an obligation through the creation of a new one which substitutes it. Sa madaling salita, ang novation daw ay kung saan magkakaroon ng total o kaya naman ay partial extinction or extinguishment or cancellation of the obligation sa pamamagitan ng pag-create ng isang bagong obligation. Alright. So, paano nga ba nagkakaroon ng total or partial extinction ng obligation? Paano ba ito ginagawa? Una, minomodify ito sa pamamagitan ng changing their object or principal conditions. Number 2, substituting the person of the debtor. And number 3, subrogating a third person in the rights of the creditor. So, meron palang 3 paraan kung paano na modify ang isang obligation. Pwede nating baguhin yung object. Pwede rin naman nating baguhin o palitan yung debtor. Pwede rin nating palitan yung creditor. Moving on, there are requisites of novation, and these are as follows. Number 1, existing valid obligation. Number 2, capacity and intention of the parties to modify the obligation. Number 3, the extinguishment of the obligation. And number 4, creation of a new valid obligation. Sa makatwid, ang mga requisites daw ng novation, kailangan meron kang existing na valid obligation. Kasi di ba nga, ang novation ay kung saan magkakaroon ng partial or total extinction ng obligation sa pamamagitan ng pagmamodify nito. So therefore, logic dictates na as one of the requisites, there must be an existing valid obligation. Number 2, syempre, intensyon ng parties na i-modify yung obligation. Kagustuhan nilang dalawa. Number 3, syempre, i-extinguish na nila yung old obligation. At number 4, papalitan nila ito ng bago. Okay, moving on to Article 1292. In order that an obligation may be extinguished by another which substitutes the same, it is imperative that it be so declared in unequivocal terms, or that the old and the new obligations be on every point incompatible with each other. So, ang point lang natin dito, para magkaroon ng extinguishment ng obligation sa pamamagitan ng pagpapalit o pagsasubstitute ng bagong obligation, kailangan i-declare ito ng napakaliwanag talaga, as in malinaw talaga. Ayan. So, Paano ba yung magsasubstitute naman ng new debtor in place of the original one? Let's talk about Article 1293. Novation, which consists in substituting a new debtor in the place of the original one, may be made even without the knowledge or even against the will of the debtor. Pero not without the consent of the creditor. Let's put it in details. Let's discuss this in details. Yun palang pagpapalit ng debtor, hindi kinakailangan na may consent ng debtor. Hindi kinakailangang ipagpaalam sa debtor. Mapapalitan natin yung debtor kahit ayaw niya. Ayan. So, pero hindi natin mapapalitan yung debtor kung ayaw ng creditor. Paano ba yun? Minsan kasi yung creditor mismo ang naghahanap ng bagong debtor. Example, uy, saluhin mo naman yung utang ni ganito. O kaya naman may third person na lalapit, o sasaluhin ko na yung utang ni A, ako na magbabayad. Though, sabi ko nga sa mga past nating lessons, hindi nila mapipilit si creditor na tanggapin. Hindi mapipilit ni third person si creditor na tanggapin yung ibinabayad niya on behalf of a debtor. Pero hindi ibig sabihin ay kapag gusto ni creditor na tanggapin, eh mapipigilan din siyang tanggapin. Ayan. So anong point natin dito? Ang point natin dito, minsan may third person na lumalapit, minsan si creditor mismo ang naghahanap ng bagong debtor. And if that's the case, pwedeng walang akaalam-alam si debtor sa nangyayari, di ba? Pwedeng walang alam-alam yung original debtor, napapalitan na pala siya o hinahanapan na siya ng sasalo sa kanya. Ngayon, kung sakali man na malaman niya na may sasalo sa kanya at ayaw niya, pwede ba siyang mapilitan na tanggapin na lang na pinalitan na pala siya? The answer is yes. Okay? Pero may consequence ulit yon na mamaya pag-uusapan natin. Ang point lang natin dito, it can be made even without the knowledge or even if there is the knowledge of the debtor, even if against his will. But of course, not without the consent of the creditor. Kailangan kapag papalitan yung debtor, alam ni creditor. Bakit kaya? Kasi di ba, yung creditor, ang credit investigation niya ay yung debtor mismo. Nag-isip siyang mabuti, nag-timbang siya ng mga reason kung bakit niya pauutangin si debtor at pumasa ito sa kanya. Siyempre, hindi po pwede napapalitan natin si debtor na hindi alam ni creditor dahil yung assessment ni creditor ng credit ay pertaining doon sa specific debtor na yun. Ayan. Next. Let's talk about different kinds of substitution. Andito pa rin tayo sa papalitan natin yung debtor. Tignan natin yung comic strip na to. Sabi, "Hi Bill, I heard Marie owes you 5,000. I would like to pay for her debt. By the way, she doesn't know that I'm paying. But is it all right with you?" Sabi ni Bill, "You know, you can't force me to accept your payment. But sure, I will accept your payment, Joe." Sabi naman nung creditor. So from here, malalaman nyo na sinabi ni creditor sa bibig niya nanggaling na hindi siya mapupersang tanggapin yung bayad, pero sige na nga, tinatanggap na niya. Ayan, syempre bayad na yun, ba't nga ba hindi pa niya tatanggapin? Ang point dito, si Maring walang kamalay-malay na binayaran na ni Joe yung kanyang pagkakautang. So, going back to expromission. Expromission takes place when a third person of his own initiative and without the knowledge or against the will of the original debtor assumes the latter's obligation with the consent of the creditor. So expromission may occur even without the knowledge of the original debtor. Expromission may also happen in cases where the old debtor has knowledge but he does not give his approval or consent to the substitution. So note that what is vital here is that the creditor agrees to accept the payment from the third person. Note that from our previous lesson, you learned that the creditor may not be forced to accept payment from a third person. So expromission, kapag yung third person ay sa kusang palo niya, ay binayaran niya yung utang ng debtor. with or without the knowledge or even against the will of the original debtor. Pag-usapan naman natin itong delegasyon. Tignan natin itong comic strip nitong tatlong magkakaibigan. Ito si third person, ito si debtor, ito si creditor. Sabi niya, by the way, Phil, this is Smart and he is willing to pay for my debt. I would like to ask if it's okay with you that it is Smart who will settle my obligation to you, which is due next month. So, eto pala si debtor yung nagsasalita. Si third person, si Phil. Sabi ni creditor, sure, no problem. So ano ba ang point natin sa delegasyon? Ang sabi rito, it takes place when the creditor accepts a third person to take place of the debtor at the instance of the old debtor. In this particular case, scenario sa delegasyon, yung debtor ang naghanap ng papalit o sasapo sa kanyang pagkakautang. That's why para bang dinidelegate niya sa third person yung kanyang pagkakautang. At in all cases, lagi niyong tatandaan, yung creditor needs ng consent. Kaya yan ay expromission or delegasyon, for sure yung creditor kailangan muna ng consent. Ang pagkakaiba lang yung expromission, yung third person ang merong initiative. Dito sa delegasyon, yung debtor ang naghanap ng papalit para sa kanya. Alright. So, pag-usapan natin tong the insolvency of the new debtor who has been proposed by the original debtor and accepted by the creditor shall not revive the action of the latter against the original obligor except when said insolvency was already existing and of public knowledge or known to the debtor when he delegated his debt. Ayan. So, tungkol naman to sa insolvency ng bagong debtor, yung pumalit dun sa old debtor. So, ang sabi rito, yung daw insolvency ng bagong debtor ay hindi nangangahulugan na parang maibabalik pa muli dun sa old debtor yung utang. Maliban na lang, syempre, kapag of course, ito ay nag-e-exist na, ayan, nag-e-exist na or known to the debtor when he delegated his debt. Kumbaga, alam naman niyang walang pambayad alam naman ni old debtor na talagang wala rin namang ibabayad yung pinagde-delegatan niya na new debtor. Kumbaga, pinropose pa niya. So, if that's the case, mari-revive yung action sa kanya. Ibig sabihin, may utang siya ulit. Hindi pa rin siya ligtas. Ayan. So, next. Effect of novation on accessory obligation. Ito na may aso. Okay. Alam niyo na yung accessory obligation. Paulit-ulit naman natin diniscuss yung tungkol sa guarantee, yung ganyan. So, yung guarantee, kung tatandaan nyo, yun yung accessory obligation. So, ano daw ba yung effect ng novation sa accessory obligation? Article 1296. When the principal obligation is extinguished in consequence of novation, of course, accessory obligation may subsist only insofar as they may benefit third person who did not give their consent. So, kumbaga, kung mabe-benefit yung third person, ma-affect siya. Pero kapag negatively ay hindi siya maaapektuhan. Tingnan natin po. Tingnan niyo si Sally. Bakit kaya siya galit na galit? Ito si Sally. Sabi niya, I never gave my consent to the novation. In fact, I never had a clue that the effected novation were instead of paying 5,000, Phil will just give Girlie a new phone. Don't worry, Sally. Phil is still obliged to pay you 500 regardless of the novation. So, si Phil and Girlie, nagkamayan siya. Tignan nga natin itong example. Si Phil, may utang kay Girlie na 5,000 with 10% interest. Ulit. Itong si Phil, may utang kay Girlie na 5,000 na may 10% interest. Si Girlie, may utang kay Sally na 500. Parties agreed that Phil will pay the interest to Sally amounting to 500. Stop muna tayo doon. I-digest natin. Kung matatandaan nyo, yung 10% ng 5,500, di ba? Ang usapan dito, si Phil may utang kay Girlie na 5,000. At ito naman pinagkakautangan ni Phil na si Girlie may utang naman kay Sally na 500. So, dun sa 5,000 na utang, dapat ang ibabayad na ni Phil 5,500 kasi tumutubo nga ng 10% interest. Pero instead na ibibigay ni Phil kay Girlie yung 5,500, ang usapan nila, yung interest na 500 ay dapat ibibigay ni Phil kay Sally dahil may utang si Girlie kay Sally na 500 pesos. So, yun yung usapan dito sa example. Okay, ulitin natin para sa mga nangangarap ng gising habang nakikinig o nanonood nitong video. Ulitin natin ha. O, makinig na. Bumalik na sa senses. Okay. Si Phil, may utang kay Girlie, 5,000. Natutubo ng 10% interest. Sa makatwid, kapag nag-due date na, ang ibibigay ni Phil kay Girlie, 5,500. Okay kayo doon. Ngayon, si Girlie, may utang din kay Sally. Ang usapan na lang nila, Phil at Girlie, yung 500 na interest na tutubuin ng pera, instead na kay Girlie dadalhin, ibabayad na lang diretso kay Sally dahil nga may utang nga si Girlie kay Sally na 500. Ayan. Okay tayo dyan sa kwentuhang yan. Ngayon, ang problema, later on, bumalik tayo dito sa may example. Later on, si Phil at saka si Girlie, nagkasundo na instead na magbayaran sila ng 5,000, si Phil, ibibigay na lang yung cellphone niya. So, nagkaroon ng novation. Di ba yung novation, pwede kang magpalit ng object, pwede kang magpalit ng debtor, pwede kang magpalit ng creditor. Dito sa novation tong dalawa, ang pinalitan nila yung object, instead na ang bayaran 5,000, cellphone na lang yung ibabayad. Kaya galit na galit tong si Sally. Ngayon, anong sabi rito? Anong sabi niya? Sabi ni Sally, hindi naman daw niya binigay yung consent niya sa novation. In fact, hindi daw niya, wala daw siyang kamalay-malay na nagkaroon pala ng novation dito sa dalawa. Paano na lang daw yung paano na lang daw yung 500 niya kung nagtatapos na sa cellphone tong dalawa. So may point naman pala siya para siya ay magalit. Pero yung aso may sinabi, huwag ka na ekang magalit, Sally, kasi huwag ka nang mag-alala. Dahil kahit na nagkaroon ng novation sa pagitan ni Phil at ni Girlie, babayaran ka pa rin ni Phil ng 500 pesos. Bakit? Because of Article 1296. Ayan. Kasi may third person na hindi naman nag-agree o nagbigay ng consent sa novation na ito at naapektuhan siya in a negative manner. Ayan. So, sabi rito, regardless of the novation, Phil's obligation to pay Sally is not extinguished unless Sally gave her consent. Wala namang consent si Sally, di ba? So, ang point natin dito, still, tama yung aso, babayaran pa rin ni Phil si Sally ng 500 kahit na nagkatapos na si Phil at si Girlie. Na cellphone na lang yung ibabayad ni Phil. Okay. So, that's the end of this story. Let's move on. Pag-usapan natin subrogation. Ano ba yung subrogation? Subrogation is the assumption by a third party of another party's legal right to collect debt. Subrogation if a third person is in the rights of the creditor is either legal or conventional. Conventional subrogation of a third person requires the consent of the original parties and of the third person. And legal subrogation takes place without agreement by the parties but by operation of law. Okay. Alam, ma'am, ano ba yung subrogation na tinatawag? Ito yung third party. Kung maalala nyo, yung third party na gustong magbayad ng utang ng may utang. Kailan ba natin masasabi na lahat ng karapatan ng creditor ay mapupunta sa kanya? Yun yung concept ng subrogation. Yung lahat, pag sinabi natin na masusubrogate na si third person ng personality ng creditor. Ang ibig sabihin ng subrogation in that particular context ay lahat ng karapatan ng isang creditor ay mapupunta na sa third person na nagbayad ng utang ng original debtor. Okay, halimbawa ako, third person, may utang ka. Nagbayad ako ng utang mo nang hindi mo nalalaman. Ayan. O kaya naman, alam mo, pero against your will, nagbayad ako ng utang mo. Tanong, masusubrogate ba ako ng lahat ng karapatan bilang creditor? Paano ba yun? Kasi ganito, halimbawa ikaw, yung utang mo talaga ay merong karampatang collateral o naka-pledge ka na cellphone. Di ba yung cellphone mo, since yun yung nakaprenta, naki-creditor yun. Tapos, ang utang mo halimbawa 5,000. Nagbayad ako ng 5,000 kay creditor. Third party ako, third person ako. Nagbayad ako ng hindi mo nalalaman o kaya naman ay alam mo pero ayaw mong pumayag. Ang tanong, pwede ko bang kuhanin yung cellphone mo na nakaprenda kay creditor? The answer is no because hindi ka pumayag na masobrogate ako, wala kang consent. So therefore, I cannot have the power or the right to ask the cellphone to be in my possession. Kasi hindi ako nasobrogate sa karapatan ng creditor. But, ayan. Pero, halimbawa, same scenario, pero different approach. This time around, pumayag ka naman na magbayad ako. Initiative ko pa rin. Expromission pa rin. Initiative ko pa rin. Masasobrogate ba ako? Pwede ko bang makuha yung cellphone mo doon sa possession ng creditor para sa akin na siya nakaprenda? The answer is yes. Ayan. So that's the difference between your giving your consent and not giving your consent. Okay? So, pag-usapan natin yung legal subrogation. Article 1302. It is presumed that there is legal subrogation, number 1, when a creditor pays another creditor who is preferred even without the debtor's knowledge. Okay, number 2, when the third person not interested in the obligation pays with the express or tacit approval of the debtor. And then third, when, even without the knowledge of the debtor, a person interested in the fulfillment of the obligation pays without prejudice to the effects of confusion as to the latter's share. Okay. Iba kasi, itong number 3 pag-usapan natin. Kasi kanina nung sinabi ko ikaw yung debtor, ako yung third person, tapos nagbayad ako utang. Yung number 2 yung dinidiscuss natin nun, na pumayag ka, ganyan. So, therefore, masusobrogate ako. Pero dito naman sa number 3, akala ko po ba, halimbawa, ayan, without the knowledge of the debtor. Bakit po without the knowledge of the debtor, nasobrogate pa rin? Iba to. Kasi yung third person, he is not interested in the fulfillment of the obligation. Dito kasi, a person interested in the fulfillment of obligation yung nagbayad. Alam mo yun. Ayan. Ayan. A person interested in the fulfillment of the obligation. Sino ba yun? Halimbawa, yung guarantor. Yung guarantor kasi, kapag hindi ka nakabayad, yari yung guarantor. Siya yung sisingilin ng creditor. Okay. So if that's the case, the guarantor is said to be a person who is interested in the fulfillment of the obligation. So if, for example, the guarantor pays the obligation even without your knowledge, still, there will be a legal subrogation despite the fact that the payment is without your knowledge. Kasi nga, he is a person who is interested in the fulfillment of the obligation. So, sana nakita nyo yung difference na kapag ang nagbayad ay third person lang at saka kapag ang nagbayad ay isang tao na interested sa fulfillment ng obligation. Okay, so what is the effect of legal subrogation? Article 1303, subrogation transfers to the person subrogated the credit with all the rights thereto appertaining either against the debtor or against third persons, be they guarantors or possessors of mortgage, subject to stipulation in a conventional subrogation. So, ibig sabihin, ang effects ng legal subrogation ay yun ang nagbayad ang magiging bagong creditor. At lahat ng karapatan ng isang creditor ay mapupunta sa kanya, kagaya ng, of course, yung possession ng mga things pledged, no? Yung mga nakaprenta, yung mga naka-collateral, mga dokumento ng mga naka-mortgage, etc. Okay, so that will be the end of this module. And I hope to see you all this is the last module anyway for this particular period. So I've already posted all, and I hope that you'll do your modules. And after this discussion, I hope that all modules are ready for submission. Ayan. So good luck sa inyong lahat, at God bless you all.